Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Pereira. The opposition led by Congress Party tried to put the government on the defensive on Thursday as the Rajya Sabha took up a short duration discussion on the state of the economy, investment climate, job creation and the challenge of rising unemployment. Macroeconomic data has been a mix of bad and good news. While there is some indication of a recovery in the manufacturing sector, private investment is yet to see any pickup. India's GDP growth accelerated to 6.3% in the September quarter of 2017-18 after dropping to a three-year low of 5.7% in the June quarter. However, economists expect a sustained recovery in the next two quarters and expect the Indian economy to grow at around 6.8% in 2017-18. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the state of economy and employment in the country. Joining me on the program today are Ajay, former Secretary, Ministry of Commerce and Industry; Nitin Desai, former Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India; SK Shashikumar, Senior Fellow, Giri National Labour Institute; and Priya Ranjan, Senior Journalist. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Mr. Desai, I'd like to begin with you. Is the economy on revival mode?
I would say that one part of the economy, the corporate sector, appears to be moving up. We've seen the recent numbers on the Purchase Managers Index, and there are expectations that the October-December quarter of earnings will show an improvement compared to what had been in the past. What I'm concerned about is that outside the corporate sector, we still have major problem areas which have not seen improvement. Agriculture is one. Farmers this year, it is estimated, have suffered a serious loss because of the fact that prices were so much lower than, and the MSP is totally theoretical for crops other than rice and wheat. Second, the MSME sector, which I think. Third, what you just mentioned, investment revival is not there. The CMIV figure shows that in the December quarter, new projects were at an exceptional low figure compared to the past. NPAs is work in progress. It's not an old it's an old problem. It's not going to get solved that easily, but we still don't seem to be on top of it. And now, two more macro problems are cropping up. One is we are underestimating the deficit impact. We are seeing what's happening in the center. But what about the states? Today, the deficit of the states is larger than the deficit of the center.
What about the sectors which have shown some kind of recovery? For instance, automobile sectors.
That's mainly the corporate sector. Yes, there is some revival. There is some sign of revival there.
But is that enough, or are you saying
that
that's not enough?
No, I don't think that is enough, because I think there are macroeconomic headwinds ahead. One is that the deficit picture looks a little more disturbing than it was last year. Oil prices. They've touched $67. Our calculations in the RBI and elsewhere are based on a $55. A $12 difference makes each dollar difference in the crude oil price makes a 10,000 crore difference.
Sure. Yeah. So, taking that point forward, Mr. Dua, how concerned do we need to be about the rising crude oil prices? Because they are not in our control, are they?
No.
I think we need to be extremely concerned, highly concerned, because as Mr. Desai pointed out, we are one of the largest importers of oil and gas in the world now. There's no longer that we were a marginal player. And if every dollar increase means $1.5 billion, $5.5 billion extra expenditure, and $10 billion straight away, an extra $10, it means $15 billion goes away straight on that. The fact of the matter is, as per the government's own figures, by end of November, we had run 112% of the fiscal deficit target for the entire year. Even if we have to start spending more on import of petrol or crude and gas, it means the government expenditure, which was in the first half of the year sustaining the GDP growth of the country, that will take a major hit.
Can we expect some kind of an impetus then in the budget to soften the blow?
See, the budget works two ways. One is increased expenditure by the government, because that's easy and direct. That, I think, the room for it is coming down, because the government, even if it goes easy on the fiscal target of 3.2% of the GDP, probably won't like to breach it beyond 3.5 or some such thing. And that would happen even if the oil impact were not there, because that's the kind of a government's commitment on salaries and others things. So I would think that the benefit which the government has been fortuitous ever since the oil prices started coming down in the last 3 years. Now upfront they will have to squarely face that, and that's going to hit inflation, that's going to hit the government's capacity to play around with government expenditure and go beyond, fiscal deficit going beyond a stage. And equally important, that's going to make the Reserve Bank of India say, we told you so that its inflation is on the horizon, so we can't be kind of playing down or softening the interest rates which you've been demanding of us.
Sure. Mr. Shashikumar, what needs to be done in the near future or immediately to try and sort out this issue?
See, I would like to focus more on my area of specialization, which is in the context of the jobs. Because I genuinely believe that spurring up private investment in India is very, very critical. And generation of quality jobs through better social protection is one of the surest means to attract more private investment. Because the external demand, particularly export demand in the global markets, are down a bit. As a consequence of which, there has to be increased sustenance of internal demand. And that is where we need to focus more. And unless and until this effective demand within the economy is spurred up, private investment will lag behind. So if you want to sustain even the growing industrial sectors, we need to push up this effective demand, and for that, to me, quality employment is central.
Okay, quality employment is essential is what you're suggesting. Private investment, Mr. Dash, has been low. What needs to be done to pick up private investment?
See, we are in big picture. So let me, take you back a little bit and not just focus on the immediate things that are happening. You see, if you look at it, we've had a cruel disruption in the India growth story of almost a decade now. Soon after the 2008 global financial crisis, so we are in 2018, for 10 years, we have had that, the India growth story getting derailed. What I mean by the India growth story is, if you go back to the turn of the century, the expectations were that there will be a resurgent India growing very fast, growing at double digit or more on a sustained basis for 20-30 years, so that by 2030, that not only India becomes the world's top 3 economies,
but the global cues too have not been in our favor.
Yes, true that the first part of the period that we are talking about, we had the global growth, which of course raised all the boats, and following which we too had a 8.5% on an average growth for 5-6 years up to 2008. After that, we've had the global shock, but I would say that in the last 3-4 years, the last 3 years of the UPA 2 were because of the policy paralysis, as we know very well, that we could not take advantage, or we were still emerging out of the global economic crisis. But the recent, the latest period of 3-4 years of the NDA 2, we have an issue. I would call it's a period of missed opportunity, because in this period, external factors haven't been adverse. They may not be very conducive, but as it's been already discussed, we know that energy prices have been low, commodity prices have been low. Of course, we've had in the export markets, the demand has not been very high. But like it was pointed out by Mr. Shashikumar, we are a domestically driven economy. Our problem has been that domestic demand has kept low, and I quite agree with him when he says that the solution to this, to this meaning India growing fast, creating jobs that, you know, of the scale that we require. We require to generate 30,000 jobs a day, you know. So, 12 million people are joining the job market every year.
Sure.
So, to meet that kind of thing, the growth ambition that India has, and in fact, the demographic dividend on which it was all pegged, the concept of the BRICS, which was developed, I'll take you back to the Goldman Sachs report
Right.
to begin with.
Right.
Now, if you look at that, all that is got interrupted, and I'm afraid we are, there are, like Dr. Desai was mentioning, there are green shoots of revival that you see, but I'm afraid that's not going to be sustainable. That is not sustainable, that is not stable,
Sure.
and we do not have a plan, so to say, as a nation, that we would be moving
we
forward.
lack a plan is what you're suggesting. Is that the real problem, Mr. Desai?
I would say that basically this year, I like the phrase missed opportunity, because actually this year the world economy was not in a bad shape. The US was booming. And if we had not had this grave disruption of demonetization, etc., I think we could have really revived the economy at least a year earlier.
But the government has said that it had to be done, demonetization.
Well, that is a different story.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
my point is that if it had to be done, why did it have to be done now? Okay, but let's not get into that.
Sure.
I want to really focus on what Shashikumar was saying about jobs. That I think is very crucial because it's true that basically demand generation in India depends on creating income in the hands of people who will spend. And who are the people who will spend? The people who will spend are partly, of course, the farming sector gets, but also people in the non-farming sector who have decent work, not people who are just in some sort of make-work type of low-grade employment. And I think he's very right to focus on this. And where will this come from? I would argue, if you look at the numbers, it so happened I recently gave the Giri lecture in Trivandrum on this. We have to create, if you take the backlog, around 16 million jobs a year. It can be done. But for that, you can't do it all through the organized sector. A crucial need is for creating decent work in the unorganized sector. This means revival of the unorganized sector, not just in the saying they're opening it up, but also upgradation, getting them to modernize, to integrate with the modern economy and so on. To me, this is a crucial thing. Second, you talked of the demographic dividend. Most of the increase in the people in the working age is going to take place in 5 northern states: Rajasthan, UP, Bihar, Jharkhand, and Madhya Pradesh. This means that your real challenge is to generate this type of dynamism in non-agricultural growth in these states. Actually, the South is almost getting into the opposite stage of an increase in dependency. We take places like Kerala. And Western India and Eastern India will get to that within another decade. So I would say, taking the longer-term view, that if I had to say something in terms of long-term growth potential, it seems to me the crucial thing is really work hard to galvanize, upgrade, modernize your so-called unorganized sector and ensure that you create good jobs, decent, well-paying jobs on a scale much larger than what you had now, and you can't do it all with organized.
See, the question is that when India turned around, 1991, liberalized, and we came out from a very different economy to a market economy. The whole idea is to, what Dr. Desai is talking about, is to unleash the animal spirits, so to say. And that process, I'm afraid, in terms of policies and in terms of governance, which were two crucial things, that process has been interrupted, unfortunately. As a result, I think the reforms have lost steam. As a result, the economy has lost steam. Unless you are constantly at it and create that environment where the so-called animal spirits are unleashed, you aren't going to get, the India dream,
Sure.
realize the India
Sure.
dream.
Yes, Mr. Dua.
Two things I want to point out. One, last year's H1, 2016-17, the GDP growth in H1 was 7.1%. That was also the annual rate of growth. That means the growth required in the second half of the year was also 7.1. Whereas during the current year, the 2018,
Yes.
17-18, we've seen a 6% average rate of growth in first half, 5.7 and 6.3. So if we have to even get to last year's figure of 7% or 7.1, we need to be growing in Q3 and Q4 by 8.2% to be able to get at 7.1. No estimate, including the Reserve Bank of India's or even the Chief Economic Advisor's government's on and off comments are expecting this kind of a growth to take place in these 2 quarters.
Sure.
Whatever the reason, I don't want to get into it. The question is it a recovery, or are we just trying to get at where we were last year? There can be somehow the other reach there. I think the answer is latter, that we are not thinking this year at all of being able to go beyond the 7.1% rate of growth seen earlier. The second issue, and which has been very rightly, I think all the panelists have talked about, is how do we get the private sector investment going, which actually is the engine for the GDP growth to rise. What we saw in the so-called golden period, 2000 to 2011, when we had this 8.2 or 8.3% rate of growth. There, I think there were 2 factors to my mind. Export certainly was there, 18% rate of growth. Per year, annual growth was 18% during that period. Now, we've been seeing a deceleration. We are all getting bored by November figures. But please look at the figures from April to October. There is a decline in the exports. And now we can no longer talk about saying that the world economic growth is not taking place. World is probably expected to grow this year at the highest it has in the last 7 or 8 years at 3%.
But everyone is looking internally, unfortunately.
Yeah, this is my point. Second, internally where we have to be looking at is in the former, how do we increase the purchasing power in the hands of the people? We all talked about rural areas, MSP, extra expenditure on social security schemes, etc. I would say even within the formal sector, we may have seen certain amount of increase, certain amount.
Yeah.
But where is the money which is being surplus or the profit going? It's going to the people who are not spending it. I refer to you to a report which says that the Indian top management gets paid 300 times what the average worker in India gets paid. The expenditure takes place by the ordinary worker.
So we're not seeing distribution of wealth,
yes,
is what you're saying.
Not only distribution of wealth, distribution of income as well.
Income, yeah, sure.
The income,
in
unless
manufacturing, 60% of the value added accrues as profits, 40% as wages.
That's right.
It's almost the opposite of what you see in.
Absolutely. So the point I was just completing is that if you want to see higher aggregate demand, the incomes have to increase of workers, both in the formal sector as well as the agriculture and informal sector.
Mr. Shashikumar has been wanting to come in on the debate for a while now. I can see him raising his hand. Yeah, go ahead.
Sure.
Yeah, a couple of points. First, I completely agree with Dr. Desai and his view about striking a balance between quantity and qualitative dimensions of employment. Of course, if you look at the quantitative dimensions of employment, say maybe 2 decades back, it was not very important to discuss about the quantitative dimensions because the open unemployment rates in India were low. But now the issue is, if you look at the current unemployment figures, the open unemployment rate may be very low, but the unemployment rate among educated young people are rising, which is a cause of concern. And that can be tackled only through a very coherent education employment policy. And that policy coherence is critical. That's point number 1. Point number 2, say the recent data, particularly released when it was discussed in the G20, I was party to this discussion, is that there is India has the largest percentage of what is categorized as not in employment, not in education, and not in training category. What is known as NEET category. There is a certain kind of inactivity that's happening. And we need to know what is causing this inactivity. Is it that the job search assistance that you provide to the young people are weak? Is it that the job aspirations are not being resorted to? I mean, these are issues that we need to look at very carefully. And the second is, as far as quality is concerned, yes, this question about labor income shares was raised. I have just done a study on wage income shares in organized manufacturing, which is coming out as a publication of the International Labour Organization. We looked at during the last 4 decades, this is 1972 to 2013, and if you look at the organized manufacturing, I'm talking of the large formal manufacturing sector.
Right.
The percentage of wage has declined something from around about 40% to something like 10-12% wage.
Right.
And the corresponding increase has happened in the profit shares. So naturally, as was referred to earlier, the people who are getting the additional share in value added are not necessarily spending it in the economy, which is a cause of concern.
Sure.
And the third point that I want to talk about is with respect to what can be done to improve quality. To me, there are 2 core issues. One is universalization of social security. We understand that India has a distinctively different employment structure.
Okay.
We are a country with 51% self-employed. We have larger number of self-employed people than wage employment. So labor regulations alone is not the answer. So I think that universalization of social security, and a substantial percentage, as we all know, of the people who are self-employed earn very low levels of income.
Okay.
And the second is
let me get closing comments now from all my guests, because I've got just 4 minutes program. Mr. Desai, what needs to be done in the immediate future to try and put the economy back on track?
If I had to give a single priority to the government, I would say, please do something to get the MSME sector back on its feet, and then work hard to get it modernized, galvanized, and really effective. If you ask me for one single thing, if you allow me to have a second one, I would say, please also look very carefully at what is happening in agriculture.
Okay, look at agriculture closely and look at MSMEs is what you're suggesting. Priya Ranjan Dash, as far as jobs are concerned, where do you think that the jobs are going to come from, and what does the government need to concentrate on?
The 2 sectors that Dr. Desai has mentioned are precisely from where you have to have the jobs. In the sense that agriculture, meaning I wouldn't say agriculture as such, but the rural economy. You have to create jobs in the rural economy. The question always deferred, saying that you have to take people out of the rural economy to the urban areas. That is a process that is unstoppable, that is bound to happen. But in the meantime, that may take 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, from a very lowly urbanized country to actually become urbanized. So moving that labor will take time.
Sure.
In the meanwhile, in the rural economy itself, you have to create jobs. So the rural economy and MSME. Now, in one word, if you say, this is the so-called animal spirits. The 2 put together are the private sector in India. Okay, it's the government, one single engine firing. That's not going to take the economy anywhere.
Animal spirit
so let's
needs
not
to be
get concerned about the fiscal deficit and things like that. Let's look at the real economy. That is the real economy.
Okay,
my point is that reforms have been overdue. Some of them have been mentioned in the labor market.
Mr. Dua,
I would only say, now do not take any unpredictable measure in the remaining year and a half of the economy. You've done all your magical work. Some have worked, some magic has worked, some may not have. Right now, let's have stability, both in terms of taxation side as also on policy, and give some time to the measures which have taken for fructify.
Okay, sure. And Mr. Shashikumar, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
I think labor-intensive manufacturing. Special packages have been announced for textiles and apparels. I think I would expect leather, food processing, handicrafts to be given special status. Second, it has already been indicated, small scales, micro and small sector. I think we need to relook at it very closely because they are staying small. I would like to have policies which makes them grow, as a consequence of which, say, you will have better formalization of workers. And third and the last point, again it has been said, to assume that agriculture, structural transformation is taking place in India. There has been an absolute decline in agricultural employment in the last 10 years. It's a very good sign. And to expect that our agriculture would completely fall and move away to manufacturing will not be right. We must give adequate emphasis on agriculture and, as has been stated, to the rural non-farm sector.
Okay.
These should be our core areas if quality jobs are to be created, and that creates sustenance for effective demand to prop up private investment.
All right. On that note, then, I'll have to call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Ajay Dua, Nitin Desai, SK Shashikumar, Priya Ranjan Dash. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me. See you again next time.